I don't have a proper introduction written, but just many thoughts, because estrangement principle, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is full of many, many thoughts, and it's hard to get a cohesive statement of it. And so some things that I was thinking were pointed to in notes that Ariel gave me from a second part, which will be presented tonight. But the phrase restlessness thinking out loud really seemed to hit the nail on the head. And I really appreciated the verve and the gregariousness of the estrangement principle of Ariel asking these questions of themselves and of the community at large, of strangers, of mentors, of friends, about what does it mean and what are the problems with calling our art and our output queer. Is that limiting us? Is that including others? I mean, it's a whole plethora of issues, which is why it's so great to all be gathered here to hear your thoughts and then fight it out or talk it out or hug it out or whatever, you know? So, you know, the word estrange, among other things, means to expel, but I felt like the things that you're talking about are not so much about queerness as an expulsion from mainstream or culture at large, society, but it's rather an estrangement from within and from this term queer. And so reaching back around, not so much in a reappropriation of the word sort of way, but just really thorough thoughtfulness about what it entails to call your work or yourself one thing versus another, or one thing amongst others. And I mean, it's identity politics still, and it's probably more than due time for a refreshed conversation about these things. And the confluences between the poetry world and the visual art world, which Ariel is touching upon fluidly in both parts of the essays. Those confluences, I think, are subject matter unto themselves that could be talked about. Just something I wanted to point out was another line from part 2. It says, I've had a plan of tentativeness, of hesitance, of plunge. And my thoughts on that, which I really like that positionality of just taking this plunge and kind of being wrong and kind of being right. And there's no wrong or right. But that's taking a big bite. There's always going to be failure. There's always going to be references missed and names left unchecked and history that one's not aware of yet or will become aware of. And that queerness, in my understanding of it and in my living of it, is really a yearning for a relation that moves beyond or through identification, that reaches towards an ideal space or some sort of utopia where we don't need to name the need to relate. But then immediately the fallout of that, the double-edged of that privileged anonymity, or the quote-unquote autonomy of the work that would come without a label, rises up and rears its head and comes back into visibility or assimilation. And so maybe these identity politics discussions are just going to circle back on themselves throughout time. And now's our moment to say what we have. So with that, welcome Ariel Goldberg.
Thank you. I hear that the mic picks up even if you don't talk directly into it. It's an honor to be here, and I genuinely appreciate all of your presences here tonight. I began collecting queer art as though it was a poetic sort of language utterance in late 2010 when I was living in San Francisco. And then it became, while I was going to shows and I was reading books and thinking a lot and talking to a lot of artists and writers, the project became a question of why would I collect queer art as though it's a thing, a language thing. So I'll be reading from part 1 and then reading totally new work that I've written in the past 3 months since mailing out 75 copies of part 1 that looks a lot at the surface of things, which is controversial in and of itself. I consider poets and artists and filmmakers and collectives and group shows and anthologies and zines and the Gay Pride Parade and a lot of voices from books of people that aren't even around anymore. And you'll get some proclamations and anecdotes from part 1 tonight. The term queer art is persisting and failing at a rapid pace for multiple reasons. The anti-definition catch-all capability sets the stage. My concern is that using queer art has become a dangerously limiting device to talk about art. It doesn't seem like a real space to be inside of or outside of. It is at first this necessary way to claim a minority space, and then what is it? How can we have the non-labeled, non-separated artist who is still valued for their variable position in this world? Somewhere between the expected and the projected, and the implicit and the explicit. I don't want to argue with the existence of queer art, but I don't want to accept it either. There is something underneath a language not feeling right. For example, queer cinema from the collection, which was a film screening at MoMA in March 2011, only included men. Like it should have been called Gay Guys or something. But queer is the mod right now. And this is Susan Sontag in her journal, Reborn, the first of the series from 1959. My desire to write is connected with my homosexuality. I need the identity as a weapon to match the weapon that society has against me. Being queer makes me feel more vulnerable. And then this is wall text in the Hide-Seek Difference in Desire in American Portraiture, which was a show that was at the Smithsonian and then traveled to the Brooklyn Museum last year. And it's the wall text for a Peter Hujar portrait of Sontag, where she's sort of putting her hands behind her head and laying on a bed, looking meditative. Sontag later regretted that she had not spoken more publicly about her lesbianism, but that kind of personal revelation was at odds to her cool, analytical tendency. The National Portrait Gallery claims to be, in the wall text for Hide-Seek, the first major museum exhibition to focus on sexual difference in the making of modern American portraiture. Yet this claim is tricky, because the first is with portraiture, but not in thematizing sexuality and gender difference. History is different than the present. I think about how the new museum had what now sounds like a kitsch title all the way in 1982, Extended Sensibilities, the homosexual presence in contemporary art. Some artists refused to be part of a show with this title. They refused to be thematized or to be outed. And then in 1996, there was the Berkeley Art Museum's In a Different Light, whose milestone was being the first queer art show that had artists in it who did not even identify as queer. It's important to note the word queer or gay does not make it to the title or subtitle of Hide-Seek, perhaps as a result of unclear problems with labels. I cannot parse the words difference and desire as euphemism or rejection. Many of the smaller shows that thematize queerness play effusively with the word queer. For example, San Francisco's Soma Art's June 2011 show, Queer It Yourself. I have an uncomfortable memory of going to see Annie Leibowitz's retrospective at the Brooklyn Museum in 2007. The many pictures of Sontag on contact sheets felt like I was getting a lesbian newsletter for the first time, long after it had been in circulation. I needed to be reminded Sontag was a dyke. The sense of reminder as opposed to recognition was also a betrayal. I felt it more with myself. I had not yet sought a strong enough queer history of my own. Sontag's New York Times obituary clearly maps her marriage to a man and their divorce, which, in the scheme of her life, was a blip. In the year of her death, 2004, the Times mentioned absolutely nothing about her lesbian partnerships, only an insulting trace. She was photographed by Annie Leibovitz for an Absolute vodka ad. The Believer ran an article on how divisive the obituaries for Sontag Sontag were in the international media, the overtly supportive and then the overtly undermining or challenging of her writing and thinking. Sontag often changed her mind, famously did. But one point remained united in her obituaries. There was no mention of her dykehood. The fear of being reduced or dismissed is a palpable fear operating in the omission of her sexuality. All I can see is the omission when I read her obituaries. Of course, you don't have to look very hard to find the lesbian Sontag. My need to be reminded Sontag was gay or care that she was ushered in the haunting affirmation of a Sontag-inspired attitude that I had developed. Is it possible to decide not to address publicly your identity if in fact your identity is partially tied up in making people less invisible? I am hopeful the fear outness will overtake or discredit your work as subsiding. In a sense, this was Sontag's problem, not mine, but I cannot help explore the problem's importance as it has yet to disappear. Sontag's private hold asks what further might be subject to invisibility and what are the implications of the invisible artist in the United States. How do we calibrate art that does not operate within the signage of queer, but is doing all the necessary political work that queer art does? Art and writing made by queers falls prey to extremes. I am interested in a turning point, of making a place for the simply out artists with their queerness unmistakably there, but not advertised as being there. Art is both privileged and disadvantaged with the queer art label. Calling your art queer ordains an audience, but also separatism. Artists could feel invisible inside a queer arts community if they don't actively label their work as queer. Thematized curation or editing of work on any category linkage like nationality, geography, gender, sexuality, race, religion, age, ability is to varying degrees distinct from themes that draw on notions of objective style. In October 2010, I went to the San Francisco Cameraworks show, Suggestions of a Life Being Lived, which was the more common queer art show, the one in a smaller city, the hometown turf of a queer mecca. I was eager to see a show unconcerned with coming out narratives, as the press release promised, manifested itself. The political action and alternative world building was the unifying factor of the show. In my first interview for this essay, I interviewed one of the curators, Adrian Sky Roberts, who told me, "What I'm interested in is a queer set of political alliances." When I asked her why on encountering the show I felt frustrated with the phrase queer art, she told me she could relate. She had just been interviewed for the web video series Culture Wire, where Meg Schiffler of the San Francisco Arts Commission asked, "What's the show about? What is queer photography?" Sky Roberts tells me, I was like, I don't know. I have a better sense of what queer means to me. Queer art is what makes that sense of queerness visible. The actual proposition to define something hits as the gravest offense. And this is a Leo Gersani quote from his book Homos. By rejecting the whole concept of identity, we risk participating in the homophobic project that seeks to annihilate us. This is a quote from Eileen Miles' book Inferno. I was meanwhile trying to learn to be a poet and didn't want to be waylaid into being gay because I wouldn't be taken seriously. And then this is a Bernice Abbott quote, and she's a photographer that was working in the middle of the 20th century. I am a photographer, not a lesbian. When I first looked up Kay Ryan, Library of Congress, I was surprised to find a total butch. Why should any poet lesbian be relevant to me? I persisted in assuming Ryan and I had nothing in common. But then a question began to haunt me. How does a dyke get to be poet laureate? The obvious answer is she keeps her mouth shut. I turned to the Library of Congress's description of Ryan on her profile page. This is the Library of Congress speaking. Unlike many poets writing today, Corrine seldom writes in the first person. Ryan says, "I don't use I because the personal is too hot and sticky for me to work with. I like the cooling properties of the impersonal." In her poem Hide and Seek, for instance, she describes the feelings of the person hiding without ever saying, "I am hiding." Corrine is out, but that doesn't mean there isn't societal homophobia at work. In her DVD series, The Poet's View, she tells this story about Carol and her reading the Sunday paper in bed. She dedicates all her books to her late partner, Carol, a gendered name. She is an intensely private person. So why do I feel threatened when I think about how guarded her personal life is from her work? Okay, this is a quote from Judith Butler from her book Undoing Gender. "The value of being besides oneself, of being a porous boundary given over to others, finding oneself in a trajectory of desire in which one is taken out of oneself and resituated irreversibly in a field of others in which one is not the presumptive center." I brought a picture of Judith Butler to the male image, a barber in the Castro, when I was trying to figure out how to write this essay. The barber was slightly irritated. I felt this tension radiating between his scissors and me. Was it that a dyke interfered with the man-on-man vibe of the space? I told him I'm an artist who does performance. I just said the haircut is for a performance. He asked when it was, and I said, I don't know, soon. I think about this retelling Judith Butler picture goes to the barber story at a Christmas party, and I felt a sense of victory with the response of roaring laughter. Then I felt like I had to really start reading Judith Butler. And I noticed that she started out in feminism and gender, and now is adamantly writing a philosophy that considers feminism and gender, but is mostly about war and fear, and the ethics of photography, and the dehumanization of people the US is at war with. She doesn't have to be just a gender philosopher, especially if you consider she didn't even know what queer theory was until people were telling her she had a hand in the making of it. And that was in the 90s. The Estrangement Principle, Part 2. When I wear a camera around my neck, I'm being a very out photographer. It's something that generates a response. People nod or stare or quiver. I become a little mistrusted, I think. The camera bounces on my chest better than any booze. I'm interested in how that's similar to looking like a lesbian, whatever that means, or looking like a guy when I wasn't born one. In the editor's notes of the lesbian issue of Heresies, a feminist publication on art and politics from 1977, Marty Pottinger writes, "The term artist serves a very similar function as the word lesbian, though the specific effect upon society is very different." Jill Johnston's transcribed journals from 1969, inside Lesbian Nation, includes this one sentence just for one day. "Tell Gregor it's pointless to write for a gay paper. He should write gay stuff for a straight paper." In a dream, I walk into an arcade and gravitate towards the whack-a-mole game. Instead of picking up the stuffed animal-style hammer, I feel inside the cavities as the moles rise and fall. This costs money, coins, that add up to a few dollars, and then I lose the game. For the past 5 years, I've been writing this book on different types of photographers, the language they use while taking and looking at photographs. To do this, I had to essentially stop photographing. Then I realized the way to finish this work, or to begin it, or to be in the middle of it, was to write from the perspective of a real photographer. Not a conceptual photographer replacing actual pictures with poetry about pictures, but a genuine street photographer, someone who wanders around looking at light and lines. So I'm showing you tonight some of my pictures from this re-emerging photographer. The estrangement principle is about examining the instability of categorization and how that gets mixed up in recognizing and naming. The estrangement principle is also a narrative of a landscape that includes where the photographer stands. It's about the feeling of urgency and doubt simultaneously. The estrangement that I at one point felt towards the words queer art got pretty muddled over the past 2 years. Now I am both inside and outside of my estrangement. A lot of the friendships I made have been under the prompt of this essay, and the questions hold us together. And I wonder, if I construct a world of engaging with the work of queer people, can the estrangement wear off? Meanwhile, I have gone through this similar process to accept the word photographer for all the ways it does and doesn't work. Part of my examination of the identifier photographer is that I actually want photography and writing to become interchangeable. What is fascinating to me about watching photography is that it is such an unstable identity right now, because anyone with a camera in their pocket is actually becoming a photographer. This is similar to queerness not being something so contained or separate, but something bleeding into everywhere, something not controllable. I don't have a separatist or an integrationist argument with the estrangement principle. I've had a method of collecting and of staring at situations as though they were photographs. It didn't immediately occur to me to read the essay that I printed and distributed in May because it seemed outdated or too hard to look at. Then I decided I would have to consider both the relationship between the thinking on queer art and the thinking on photography as these two odd movements. The word queer is safe and fraught because it is an umbrella for so many different things, even its own history. Queer Nation's manifesto from 1990 inhabits a vastly different context than now because of the AIDS crisis, for one, when people were dying every day. Queer was then a new word to introduce. The manifesto says, well, yes, gay is great, it has its place, but when a lot of lesbians and gay men wake up in the morning, we feel angry and disgusted, not gay, so we've chosen to call ourselves queer. Using queer is a way of reminding us how we are perceived by the rest of the world. I can propose there should be no identity-based descriptors on artists, but a lot falls out of the frame when making that proposition. Primarily, there is still violence daily against trans and queer people. There is still discrimination against things that openly deal with queer issues or feature artists who are queer. For this reason, it is a necessity to bring the word queer and all of the other more specific identifiers up to the surface of the daily discourse. And it's a self-identifier, and therefore, for someone to judge over when to use it or not is mismatched. I'm not criticizing people's use of queerness as a material or theme in their work. or for queer living in the description of the work, but can it also be challenged? I'm skeptical about the expectation for artists who are queer to have their identity or lifestyle or history be tied to their subject matter. The choreographer, all I'm thinking about is photography these days. The choreographer, Katie Pyle, invited me to be in a scene of her dance piece, The Firebird, which is a queering of the classic Stravinsky ballet. I got to become a prince and flail in an echo of rudimentary ballet moves on various stages this past year. My gender in this context was not invisible or questioned, it was turned celebratory. And I made friends with people I have a lot in common with. I realized questions in the estrangement principle might seem not only contradictory to any work that uses the word queer in explaining itself, but a criticism of it. I wrote this essay because I wanted to ask uncomfortable and what seemed publicly silenced questions. This essay hits on a lot of sensitivities for people who are queer and working within a historically marginalized group. It also hits on sensitivities of people who are visible and queer and who have worked very hard to get there. And so, a lot of the writing seems to turn into private conversations that go in a lot of different directions. Like, I cannot believe that pop singer who is closeted, or who is calling their work queer when they don't seem queer? Or why is it that when I type Fran Lebowitz lesbian into a search field, all I find is a Village Voice blog post about how she sort of came out by using the first person plural and talking about gay people in her Martin Scorsese documentary, Public Speaking. Sarah Schulman writes in Gentrification of the Mind, in another era, the late fiercely radical lesbian visionary Jill Johnston could publish hardcover books in mainstream corporate publishing houses with no capital letters. Now she would have to self-publish Lesbian Nation, and no one would know it existed. How ideas are allowed to be expressed has narrowed considerably in the current era. When I walk into every bookstore in the East Village and ask, do you have Lesbian Nation? And when the answer is no, I feel a presence in that absence. I wrote the estrangement principle to create a field of dissonance, which is not the first thing that comes to mind when I naively imagine a community. But shouldn't it be? One way I've tried to think about the ideas of this essay is through performance. My friend Jess Barbagallo and I created May Lyon as the alter ego for Kay Ryan, but now it might be my alter ego as well. Kay Ryan, by the way, hasn't responded to the essay since I handed it to her in the Barnes & Noble sponsored book signing line at her reading at the 92nd Street Y in May. May Lyon is the psychic lack of lesbian sex or lifestyle in Ryan's poetry, so she has no clear age. I've even worn a Silence Equals Death t-shirt while performing as May Lyon. The alter ego is about a fantasy of mine that a poet laureate would have lesbian content in their work and it wouldn't even be a big deal. May Lyon's premiere was reading to a crowd of 15 or so friends at Uncanny Valley in Long Island City this past spring, right after a solo cellist named Meaner Pencil as seen on the New York City subway. This guy came up to me after the reading and said that I totally changed his idea of what sexual intercourse was. The poem was about hand sanitizer, potato chips, and latex gloves. I made a plan this fall to return to Fire Island. I wanted to photograph a place where I marveled at the visual surroundings of so many gay hues. I wanted to be a tourist inside a place after watching so many tourists photograph, which is how I collected language for my poetry about photography. What happens when I photograph a place with rainbow flags and penis pendants for sale in the convenience store window? Do my photos become more queer than, for example, the photo of interesting-looking rocks on the other side of the island? The side of the island that has a bridge near a town called Mastic Beach, where it's cheaper to stay than Cherry Grove. Those are the rocks. I read in the Violet Letter, the online one. This one's nicely behind some glass. This is the Cherry Grove newsletter, that they fared pretty well in the storm, better than other communities on the island, but that the whole place is shut down for cleanup. When I was walking around Cherry Grove in September, the theater there was clearing out their storage, getting ready to archive, as several volunteers announced to me when I stopped in to say hello. I then saw in their pile of garbage 2 boxes filled with 8x10 box frames, which are exactly the frames that I buy new from Adorama. Each frame was emptied of the picture, but had a rectangle with a sort of sweat-stained shadow of a print on this felt. The archivers told me to tape the frames. I notice how the Fire Island Queer Artist Residency appears to have a male-dominated roster this summer. I looked at a picture online, which I realize is not an accurate source to personal identifiers. The 2 ArtFag City features about the residents size up the bond in each artist's work to queer identity as if it is a barometer. When I was applying, I felt confused about how to contextualize my work. I find it strange to have to quantify my queerness in an application. Shouldn't it be enough to care and be engaged in a community and a culture and a history? Is it enough to just be queer? If the queerness does not come up in the work, then how could that read as a rejection of the community and the culture and the history? I notice how the Lambda Literary Awards, called the Lammies, don't include trans poetry as a category yet, but they have trans fiction. The Lambda Literary Foundation announces their fellows with a webpage of bios that I find really interesting to read because there are so many varying but yet persistent styles of identifying. I'm going to select for you here. I take the names out and read just the first sentence as a list. Is a butch, anti-racist white Southerner from Atlanta, Georgia. Is a blue-collar transgender visual artist and self-taught writer. Is the queer son of Salvadoran refugees. Is a New York-based writer and educator. Is a butch fag diva living and working the gender blur in Oakland, California. Is a novelist from Iowa now based in New York. Is a queer femme with a disability. These bios are doing a lot of work about visibility and rights and the personal becoming more present, also pointing to privilege inviting absence. Often I have the fantasy that we just have names and not bios, because bios are a hassle to write. Of course they are practical and a way to find someone's work and context. And then there is the whole discussion of the professionalization of art to consider. I think about when I'm reading, these chopped up bios out loud, that my own bio is really boring. I could write a vague one and be more coy. I could put my queer identity in a bio or not, and that is a choice. Are we infected with too much carefulness? Am I not careful enough? Am I forcing myself to be less careful? This reminds me of Darren Klein's zine project and sometimes exhibition, 21st Century Queer Artists Identify Themselves, a long title. The zine takes to task identity politics in a trendier, I'm here and I'm queer synth pop ringtone. Queer Artists is like a joke art forum. It has fat stapled pages that function as calling cards for artists, addressing the need and distastefulness of making oneself visible. In part 1 of the Estrangement Principle, I was looking at publishers of almost exclusively queer writers who don't mention necessarily that in their mission statement that they publish queer writers. For example, Nightboat Books their mission statement is to, quote, develop audiences for writers whose work resists convention and transcends boundaries by publishing books rich with poignancy, intelligence, and risk. During the discussion after my first reading of the Estrangement Principle in Berkeley in March, a poet said they would never be in a gay anthology or a queer one because their work doesn't deal with gay or queer issues. But how do you draw the line? I decided to send poetry to a trans and genderqueer anthology edited by Tim Peterson Trace and T.C. Tolbert. How else to expand even my idea of what is inside anthologies that consider the words queer or trans in all their multitudes? I got an email from someone writing about trans literature on the Lambda blog looking to interview me on the topic. I responded to them that I don't feel like an authority on trans literature, but I sent him a PDF of the Estrangement Principle. Z writes back to say, I sure as hell wish that you were trans. This is exactly the kind of inquiry and depth I'm looking for. I guess Z read the part in the essay where I identify as a dyke. I wrote back to say I'm not trans, and that I identify as more than one thing. What would it mean to have somebody who identifies indeterminately in a feature on what trans literature is? I went to the New York Public Library picture collection this fall, where the system is over 100 years old, which isn't much of a problem for the cat and flower folders. When I asked if they had a queer folder, I got redirected to Bohemian Life and the homosexual. When I asked how I could find the transgender folder, I got directed to impersonators. The librarian told me about how 10 years ago, an artist used images in the homosexual folder for collages. Then, after his show at a Chelsea gallery, the homosexual folder got stolen from the library. It's still a mystery who took it. Maybe somebody here knows. The pictures collection staff, slowly, in the past 10 years, has begun to recreate the homosexual folder. But it is horrifying, really, because most of the images are of people getting married or wearing military uniforms. The librarians build folders by cutting up magazines from subscriptions and also books that are too damaged to still be in circulation. I learned the artist is Christian Hallstad, who in an interview entitled Homophobic, chronicles his process of copying the homosexual folder at a nearby Kinko's. I had a similar emotional response to the images that Hallstad had. With the protest documentation, we both felt sentimental pride. And then with the images of same-sex nudity, a nervousness about looking at porn in a public library. One of the photography students from the class I took to the library was at a nearby table looking at the smoke folder. We had a brief conversation about the various ways to do double exposures, and then we went back to our files. Hallstad noted that while he copied the images in the folder, he started organizing them into his own categories to prevent duplication. He talked about finding a lampshade inside the folder and looking for a penis on it, then realizing it was misfiled. In making the slideshow for this talk, I put 50 images into piles of different categories so I would be able to alternate them. Those words in my head were street, weird things, nature, and queer. The categorizing was this strange version of impulse. Coming after was a show curated by John Davies at the Power Plant in Toronto in early 2012. Zoe Leonard's essay in the catalog, as someone who lived through the AIDS epidemic in New York, to which the title of the show refers, mentions feeling queasy when younger queer artists pine for the activism of the late 80s and 90s. Leonard points out how you cannot exactly desire to be around for a period of mass death. Many people are writing about the unacknowledged impact of AIDS in New York City, particularly as traumas on the surviving people. After watching United in Anger, the recent documentary about ACT UP, I feel the absence of the recognition for the epidemic outside of the gay and queer communities. How do I fathom such loss while knowing that when I was growing up, I had this information obstructed from view? John Davies is referring to this experience with the statement for his show coming after. He says, "These artists seem more interested in a dynamic play of absence and presence, the effects of bodies and atmospheres of spaces, than in identity." I recognize a similar sentiment of queer trying to distance itself from identity in Carlos Mota's description of his We Who Feel Differently show, symposium, online archive, and book. He's got all his bases covered. In a Village Voice interview for the occasion of his show at the New Museum, Mota says, "One of the things that was really important to me was thinking beyond individual identity politics. Like this kind of please accept me, as opposed to saying, you know what, I can see the world in a way that you can't, and the way that I see it is actually really great, so you should come on that ride with me." At the Whitney Biennial, this past spring, I saw somebody wearing a pin that said, "Give poetry a try." It's not surprising to me that poetry has this stigma in the US, but that's because it doesn't make any money. It was strange the pin took the please accept me tone. I almost suspected the pin was making fun of poetry. That poetry had a queerness to it because it doesn't care about economy, and it's so marginalized. And I wondered, is that person wearing that pin really a poet? And that was a useless ping pong to play, but one symptomatic of a small, or is it not small, but just not visible space? I am on a San Francisco listserv called Gay Rods. There was a great thread about Dave N's Faggots, the musical, which is an acronym for Fabulous Artistic Guys Get Overtly Traumatized Sometimes. Somebody posted about the musical's ending, where someone asked if the theme of exclusion from queer communities got brushed under the rug in the big happy ending of the piece. And that comment did not go over well. Most of the Gay Rods posts are for housing, which are also descriptions of what people want in a queer home. Gay Rods has a rule about including a piece of fluff in a listing. Fluff gets policed by the older rods if it's absent, because its value is the non-purposed communication. I've thought about the role of someone who watches. I've thought about soliciting interviews for this essay on Gay Rods and how I really just read and don't post, but that's really because I don't live there. And I also feel like Gay Rods should just be what it is. I want to interview more people, formally or informally, whatever suits the person, about all these questions. When I printed and distributed part 1 of the Estrangement Principle, I knew it would come out as a hard crop. The frame only includes so much. It doesn't include all the shots that are not focused enough that I had to chuck, or the ones I never took and just lost that way, or it includes the blind spots. But the blind spots managed to spread and regenerate. Could the Estrangement Principle resemble the form of flat instances, where the framing becomes a problem and the narrative doesn't solve it? That's it.